from the attendees report, we have people joining us from as far away as Tel Aviv, Australia, Germany, London, France, and Brazil. Welcome all. And we have a very exciting matchup today featuring two of the leading web CMS platforms on the content management landscape, Drupal and Sitecore. And also joining me today is my co-host, Scott Lewer. Scott is the lead analyst of the WCM practice for Outsell's Gilbane Services and the president of CM Pros. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Veronica. So happy to be here. Thank you.
It is going to be an exciting show today, I do believe.
It's going to be
Now,
great.
before we get started, I'd like to briefly explain the process. Our CMS-Connected guests today will each be asked 10 hardball questions from Scott. Now, after both vendor guests have replied to each question, I'm going to read out any posts from the attending audience, and at the end of all of the questions, the audience can ask our guests any general questions until the end of our show today. And of course, feel free to tweet using the hashtag CMS-Connected. Also, before we begin, I'd like to introduce our sponsors. Falcon Software. Falcon provides web creative, e-commerce development, content management, social media, and mobile solutions for organizations across the globe, with a focus on delivering your web project on time, on budget, and to your complete satisfaction. And I'd also like to introduce CM Pros. CM Pros helps its 16,000 plus members all over the world to succeed by enhancing their knowledge and expertise, sharing practices, and connecting business members, corporate, and individual practitioners to further develop the industry as a strategic business imperative. All right, let's get to today's matchup. First, I'd like to introduce Darren Guarnacha, Senior Vice President of Product Marketing for Sitecore. Welcome, Darren.
Hello, and thank you.
You are so welcome. And welcome to our second guest representing Drupal, Brian House, Vice President of Marketing for IKEA. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, thanks. That's Acquia, but thanks. Great to be here.
There you go. I do these beautiful phonetic pronunciations, and then I screw it up. All right, well, welcome to you both. I'm now going to turn things over to my co-host, Scott Lewer, to get the ball rolling. Scott, it's your turn.
Great. Thanks so much. And can we forward the slides here? Let's go to question number 1, unless I'm not seeing the... Are we looking at the Falcon Software slide, or is that just me?
I see it.
We are looking at it, and we're working on it here at home base, so I say just go right
All
ahead.
right. No problem. So the first question, so just to kind of set the stage here so everyone knows, we want to make sure that we've really been looking forward to this for a long time. We want to make sure that the first question, we're going to allow each of both Darren and Brian to introduce their organizations to set some context for everyone. And then when we get on with it, we'll do a question. We'll kind of snake the questions back and forth to each. Sometimes it'll be the same question, sometimes different ones. And we're going to, the attempt here is not to really dig in as much necessarily into features and functions, but we really want to understand the kind of key differences between these organizations, and I think it's going to draw on a lot of key differences between their models as well. But so let's get started with Darren first. Darren, softball question here. Tell us about Sitecore. Tell us kind of what you do, your differentiators, and who you serve.
Sure thing. Thanks, Scott. So Sitecore is a digital marketing platform and a technology that really had its roots in web content management, although over the last couple of years we've really evolved, starting with that enterprise class customer, customers like Starbucks, like Computer Associates, who are powering their global websites, and now as mobile and social and email and all these new channels are converging, we're weaving all those together into what we call the customer engagement platform. Offices around the world, over 2,500 clients, over 30,000 websites, and a very partner-centric organization. But we're really about empowering companies, organizations to get the most out of their digital interactive channels.
Great. Excellent. Okay, great. Brian, let's give you the chance to do the same thing. tell us about Acquia.
Sure.
So,
Sure. So I will start first by talking about Drupal. Drupal is an open source project. It powers more than 1 million websites around the globe, and it's built and managed by a community of more than 600,000 members who organize and develop code collaboratively at Drupal.org. What makes Drupal unique is it provides a native content and social experience. We call this social publishing. It's the interaction of social tools that you like blogging and profiles and things like that, alongside a web content management platform, all native in a single platform. The nice part about Drupal is it's an open modular framework. There's over 10,000 modules, and people can really build great web experiences with Drupal. Now, Acquia is a commercial support organization for Drupal. We are a member of the Drupal community. We are a large company. We're more than 150 people and raised more than 40 million in capital, or close to 40 million in capital to date. And we're there for organizations to provide enterprise support, guidance, and hosting for Drupal websites.
Got it. Okay, so thanks so much for that distinction, because I know that some confuse that, and I'll ask a couple of questions to hone in on that a little bit later about that relationship between the two organizations. But let's start with the question number 2 to you, which is really, you talked about this notion of platform. That was, your words, but I was going to ask you the same thing, which is, there's this, what I hear from customers who are looking at it, as well as for folks who have used the product, is that there's, the knock on it is that there's very little out of the box. It's more of a platform rather than or a framework rather than a product itself. Yet it seems like people don't necessarily have that expectation walking into it. That every implementation requires, quite a bit of services, both initially and in the long term. Can you define, first, number 1, is that fair? And 2, can you define the difference in your mind between platform versus product?
Sure. Drupal itself is definitely a platform. It provides a broad array of capabilities that allow people to build websites. We don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. We think it provides web developers, and one of the key reasons that people choose Drupal, it gives them tremendous flexibility to build the experiences they want, whether those be integrating third-party data or other systems, whether they be providing sort of design flexibility and the ability to create pixel-perfect designs and really not limit the creative teams that are building websites. So I think that is certainly something that when people select Drupal, that's what they're looking for. Now, in our market, we have what's called distributions. They are packaged offerings of Drupal that are designed for specific use cases. And this helps organizations who are looking to select Drupal or to try Drupal, gives them an advanced starting point, particularly for business buyers who aren't interested necessarily or don't know how to ingest a platform model. So an example of this is Acquia Commons. This is a distribution designed for internal and external facing community websites. So organizations like Mercedes-Benz, Red Hat, PayPal, and others are built developer communities, consumer research communities utilizing Commons. And so this gives them a much further advanced starting point and allows them to focus whatever development resources they do have on creating a unique experience. And Commons is just one of many distributions. There's Open Publish, which is developed by a partner of ours for the publishing industry, Open Scholar for higher ed, for faculty websites. And this is a way that Drupal sort of crosses this line, and the community crosses the line between creating a very powerful flat platform and then packaging that up for solution-oriented deployments.
Okay, so just to follow up on that, I want to be really clear, though. Some of those packages, which kind of get you closer to that, out-of-the-box experience, essentially are provided by you being Acquia as a services organization, or by another partner or services organization out there, right? In other words, when they buy that, do they have to essentially also they're buying your services, right? So they can't use
no, that's actually incorrect.
Okay, great.
There is no software to buy. The distributions in the Drupal community, whether they come from Acquia or developed by partners with specific vertical or application expertise, it's all based on Drupal. It's all built on the core platform. It's all licensed by the GPL license, and it's all available for free download. So you don't necessarily have to buy any services from Acquia in the form of support or hosting or subscriptions to utilize Commons or any of the other distributions that are available.
Great, thank you. Okay, Darren, over to you. So let's talk about the same notion, I think, because in the proprietary world, we'll call it that for this session. I don't know if is there a better term? Do we say closed source for comparing these things? Same type of thing here. Yeah, commercial. There you go. Well, I think there's commercial open source too. So
yeah, I'm not sure if that works for.
Yeah, exactly. So let me just say proprietary for the sake of this webinar. We'll debate what the word should be later. So on the proprietary side, I feel like there's much more of a kind of through the sales process, which there is a much more obvious sales process up at the front, that there's much more of this, you should be able to have more out of the box, and I should be able to actually install it. Yet I also hear about Sitecore similarly, that it's also kind of more platform than product, and that there's a fair amount of, fair amount more, I think, relatively speaking, than others, services required to implement and to kind of get some of which is kind of sold through the selling process. What's your thought on that? Is that fair?
Sure. I think that in some ways, yeah, I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. This is really important when you get into large enterprise class projects, right? The customers need this certain level of flexibility, and they want to be able to extend the platform. They want to. So a lot of the out-of-the-box systems tend to have very simple UIs and lots of out-of-the-box features, but they're not quite extensible. You can't change the way they behave. And I think that's great for the small organization and the small business that just sort of wants something quick and up and running. But the problem you face is that when it doesn't work by default the way you want it to work and you have to extend it, you're often painted into a corner. So I think that the platform players that have really moved into that enterprise sector have really had to engineer things so they were extensible, and that for instance, underneath the waterline in Sitecore, everything is built with this nice pipeline architecture where you can plug in at any point in the product and extend it and alter the way it behaves. We like to say that there's nothing you can't change in Sitecore, and that's that platform level, and that's just sort of, that's the table stakes of being an enterprise player nowadays.
Okay, so I like that you've now introduced for us this notion of enterprise, because I think that both of your organizations are, and that moves us to our next question, so we can advance the slide here. I think both of you, on the Drupal side, Acquia Drupal side, and on the Sitecore side, there's been this real big kind of emphasis on the enterprise. So I want to just, for purposes, again, of clarification for this webinar, when I refer to enterprise, I'm talking about your kind of large organizations, and maybe not necessarily Global 2000, but up in that range. We're talking about lots and lots of employees, lots of, I'm talking about the higher end, not just enterprise from the standpoint of, wide scale and breadth. So enterprise fit. Help me understand how Sitecore is appropriate in the enterprise, especially given your philosophy of the approach where you've built in much of the capabilities. The notion of WCM is expanding its boundaries beyond the likes of just what was WCM 10 years ago. Now we've got analytics, and now we've got marketing automation, we've got email management. Help us understand this notion. Isn't in the enterprise, wouldn't they already have many of those capabilities? And so then does a Sitecore fit into that very well?
Sure. First of all, let's just define what an enterprise needs. What makes an enterprise that kind of organization? What's unique about that? So the first thing is that it of course has to scale, but that's sort of a given. We've been having to do that for a long, long time. It's that notion of flexibility. I have my kinds of requirements. Enterprises have these unique sets of requirements that are not what everyone else needs, and so you have to have that flexibility. Now, the reason why we started layering in all these other components is is that the idea of best of breed is a great notion until you start, getting weighed down by the cost of all these integrations. So we watched all of our customers integrate Sitecore with all of these best of breeds over and over and over again, and we saw patterns in what they were trying to do. And so what we said is, let's create some reference integrations of our own, and then if they don't want to use our solutions, they still become natural integration points to, for instance, a web analytics vendor or a marketing automation vendor. We have lots of customers that are integrating us with, say, Aprimo. International Speedway Corp uses us and Aprimo and Omniture. And so we're often integrated with all these best-of-breed platforms, but the fact that we've done some of the pre-work, some of the pre-thinking, and we've really thought through how can you connect analytics to your web content management system with our own, it's also that natural integration point that we can use with all these best-of-breeds as well. And that's the nice mix that we've got at the enterprise level.
Great. Okay. All right, so we don't lose anything. So if I'm a prospective Sitecore buyer and I loved the demo, you showed me all these great things you could do with the analytics package, I shouldn't worry that if I've got Omniture that suddenly things change and I lose some of that capabilities that you sold me on?
No, you can use both. And the sort of the beauty of that architecture, for instance, is Sitecore collects an amazing amount of information about, what your behaviors are, what you're trying to do, what was working, what's not working, and all that can be passed through to Omniture. So all this idea that we have around engagement value and really creating this sort of KPI on what's working and what's making you truly engaged, that data can be passed into the Omniture tags, or we can call the Omniture API, because we're collecting that information already. Why not pass it off to Omniture? It just makes sense.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, Brian, let's turn this question over to you then and talk about enterprise fit for you. So I have a different kind of spin on my question for you from an enterprise standpoint. I mean, when I work with enterprises and they're using our services to help find a web content management package, the biggest things that we've seen, and I don't think this is certainly anything unique to my situation, but is that the buyer is really shifting a fair amount. Right, that the business buyer, while they were always an influencer now, tends to kind of own the process now, and IT tends to be supporting that process rather than driving it as much. We're seeing a shift, I think. Do you think that just open source in general and Drupal specifically tend to lend themselves to be, appropriate for that environment? Aren't marketers kind of tend to be skeptics of IT? Isn't there that stress there, and wouldn't they worry that, okay, now a platform like this that I've got to work with all these thousands of modules to kind of get my solution in place, wouldn't I be worried that I'd be actually more dependent on my IT shop or my service provider than I would be if I purchased a proprietary system?
Actually, in practice, I really don't think so. Just last night, I hosted a panel in New York City, and I had the heads of their web for NBC Universal, the New York Stock Exchange, and The Economist. And in the panel, I asked that very question. I said, one of the questions we always get about Drupal is around the end-user training, the business unit training, and is this somehow harder with Drupal or with open source as compared to existing systems? And what I was surprised to find from our panelists was, very much the opposite reaction. What they have found and what we typically see from proprietary systems, certainly a lot of the Web 1.0 enterprise content management platforms that tried to move to the web and treat web content in the same way they treated document production for drug discovery or for legal management, was that those systems were actually incredibly complex to use. And what we heard from all of the panelists was that by moving to Drupal, they've actually streamlined the production process for content contribution to the site, and they have their users clamoring for it. New York Stock Exchange, they had dumped a very large proprietary system in favor of Drupal, and so after doing that, they needed to launch a number of sites quickly just to start to develop proof points for the business. And users were blown away by how much they were able to do with their Drupal sites that they were being delivered and how much easier it was in their existing system. So demand went through the roof. He told, Bob Kerner from the New York Stock Exchange told a story about one of the sites that they launched. They actually launched a day early. And he got a call from the site owner on the business side and said, hey, what's going on? And he's like, oh, we can pull it back. He's like, no, don't pull it back. We've been waiting for this. We'll get the content in right away. And they were able, there's so much pent-up demand for easier to use, much more seamless publishing. We saw NBC talked about how one of the ways they measure the ROI of their content management systems and their websites is the amount of content produced in a given period of time. And they talked about Telemundo.com and how with Telemundo they saw a 10-fold increase in the amount of content coming from the same editorial team to their website once they moved that website to Drupal. And this was
so let me pause you there for a second.
Ease of use.
So, okay, so yeah, let me pause you there for a second. So I think you opened up a whole bunch of potential questions there that I hope that we'll get to over the next, 80 minutes. One of which is ease of use. I want to dig into a little bit because I hear some knocks there on both sides, but specifically this notion that so I understand valuing the ROI based on the content that's produced. I also know that there's a cost equation that goes into ROI, and I don't want to get away from that. Are you basically are you saying here that there is not as much of a dependence on the services organization, whoever that may be, whether it's the IT shop downstairs or whether it's Acquia from outside? Are you saying that there's not that heavy dependence, and that if I am of the mindset where I'm averse to that, I shouldn't be worried about that here with Drupal?
Yeah, I mean, going back again to the New York Stock Exchange, his primary objective as an IT organization serving the business is to hand the sites over and then let the site owners own their sites. They own the content. They can own changes to that. Certainly, if they need to write code to add new functionality, they're going to need IT. But effectively, is to make them self-sufficient. And we see this repeated in the higher education industry, where they have a central IT and they have decentralized site management in the department level. We certainly see this in large organizations in healthcare as well as in media and entertainment. There's nothing unique to Drupal or open source that says somehow to contribute content to a web page or to make a change on a site requires a heavy IT overhead just to make small changes. And in fact, one of the things that Bob said was, as they evaluated the existing system before they chose to Drupal, and this is a story he's told a number of times, to change a menu item in their existing system. He asked their engineering team, well, how do we do that? Oh, you got to write code. You can't do that. You can change the text on that, but you can't change the system. That requires code to be written. He's like, what if I want to add a new menu? Oh, you can't do that. You need to do that. These are all things that can be done in the application interface with configuration, no coding in Drupal. We talk about...
That's actually the next, Brian, hold on to that. I'll let another audience question come in here. I know that Veronica's got one, and I will let you keep going on that because the next question is about configuration versus customization. So let's take a question from the audience. Veronica?
Great. Thanks, Scott. That's right. The questions are coming in fast and furious. And Brian, this is for you. It's a question for Drupal. With so many packages, it seems as if the code base may become fragmented with customizations. Does this present challenges with upgrades, is the question.
So, I think that there's certainly lots of modules available, and it's a platform, and it's an open platform. So certainly there's situations where organizations will write custom code to meet their requirements. But I don't think there's anything with regards to Drupal specifically that would suggest that that's any different than closed source technology. We're working with a large technology company that's building a developer community. They had a proprietary community software package. They did a lot of customization to meet their requirements. And then when they went to upgrade, they got a bill, a quote for $300,000 in services to upgrade their customizations. That had nothing to do with Drupal. That had nothing to do with open source. but in fact was just, the reality of how they added features to their technology. What that did, the size of that cost, created an inflection point where they looked at alternatives, and in that case, they decided it was more cost-effective to choose Drupal to build the next generation of that platform and migrate their content from their old community into this new community than it was to pay to upgrade that. And this is a story I hear over and over again. So anytime you're working with enterprise software, my background was at Documentum before I came to Acquia. If you invest and spend a great deal on customizations rather than configuration, there's always going to be cost associated with upgrading. It's nothing more unique to open source or Drupal than it is to any proprietary system.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Hope that answered your question. And Scott, back to you. Okay.
So yeah, let's continue on, and now we're on question number 4, and we'll talk about this configuration versus customization. I have a general concern. I think about the model, just that you actually kind of touched on this in your answer to the last question, Brian, about this notion of you can just kind of let them have it, and if they want to customize it, they want to add something, they can go ahead and do that. My worry in general with open source, as opposed to the proprietary model, is that because customers have access to that code and the source, and because they can go ahead and change it, that there's less configurability kind of built into the product itself. And so this whole notion that we, in kind of proprietary software situations, you think of customizations as not necessarily being good, that you try to avoid them as much as possible. Is that the case? Do you feel like Drupal is less configurable than others, and that people tend to over-customize, and that might get them off the upgrade path?
No, actually, I really don't. If you go to our website, acquia.com, one of the first things you'll see on the homepage is Web Content Management, and that takes you to a landing page. And the banner across that is Stop Coding, Start Assembling. We have a term that we like to refer to called the assembled web. It's open modular frameworks like Drupal and the ability to add modules and configure in a module rather than writing code. Drupal best practices that we espouse to our customers, that the community espouses very, and advocates very vociferously in the community, is that you never hack core. You never hack core Drupal because that's going to result in changes that are going to impact your site and are going to make it difficult to upgrade. But B, if you're doing programmatic activities, you want to write a module for that, and then be focused on configuration in the module rather than constantly writing custom code to accomplish your goals, because it's going to be that much harder to identify where problems are when you do exist. So I think Drupal development best practices are very well understood. There's lots of resources available and lots of training resources available from ourselves and our partners. And I think the focus in our world is eliminating some of that customization and focus on configuration and working within modules and assembling modules to do the heavy programmatic lifting in a Drupal application.
So maybe less core and more modular, but there, what is it? How many? 9,000, 10,000 different modules that are out there.
Yep.
That worries me as somebody. I mean, how well tested people tend to build versus. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's a typical long tail curve, right? There's 40 modules or 20 modules that are used on 90% of websites. And then there's 9,000 modules that are used on 1 website or 5 websites or 10 websites or whatever it might be. And you can see that in the usage statistics. Again, at this panel, since this is fresh in my mind, the CTO for theeconomist.com, the value for these modules for him is, look, every module may not be, there's going to be code quality variability in that because just the nature of the law of numbers. But what it does is it gives you an advanced starting point that his development team can start and move forward and work with to develop modules that meet their needs. So and I've worked on the proprietary side, as I said. The software code quality and development is the processes for that are really no different on that side than I've seen in the open source world.
All right, I want to move this over. Let's bring Darren back into this because he's been waiting for a while. Darren, talk to me about configure versus customize. My question for you is that flexibility that Brian espouses is one of the cores to open source and one of the keys that kind of keeps people happy with Drupal. Does that mean then that those same companies wouldn't want to look to Sitecore because they can't do some of that customization? How does it work in the proprietary world?
So in the proprietary world, you essentially engineer into the core products, like I mentioned earlier, this notion of, we call it a pipeline. Any sort of interaction model, any area where you have places you want extension points, we create what we call a pipeline, which is a series of steps. It's a well-documented way to extend the product. It's done in an upgrade-friendly way. So what you do is you, instead of writing and changing the code, you basically subclass and extend. And so you inherit from the base component, whatever it is, and then you make your enhancements or your modifications. So you're never stepping on the core system. You're always extending it in an upgrade-friendly way, and that's how we keep our customers and our partners from stepping on themselves, by really engineering that all the way through its base, so that every corner of the product is extensible. And then we put a ton of configurability in everything we make. The entire application itself. So Sitecore is actually architected on Sitecore. You can go into what we call our core database, and you can actually just start changing menu items. You can actually change the look and feel of the product. You can change every part of Sitecore, and you're actually using Sitecore to change Sitecore. So at the end of the day, everything has been built around configure. And then if you need to really change application behavior, a lot of that can be done in a configurable way. And then if you have to engineer, you can engineer in that sort of safe extension way.
Okay.
And Scott, I'm going to jump in here because we've got a question for Sitecore. So Darren, the audience member, wants to know, how do you oversee your partner base to make sure they are not over-customizing the platform and thereby creating a greater degree of lock-in for customers?
Yeah, awesome question. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this because Sitecore is a very engineering-centric company, partner-centric company. We have 700 partners around the world, and we're continuously growing that partner base. And one of the things that we've got to keep doing, as our partners do almost all of our implementation work, we have professional services, but it's almost always done with and through a partner. And so what we do is provide our partners things like architectural review services. We'll come in and look at their code bases. We actually encourage all of our partners to submit their designs so we can take a look at them and make sure they're not painting themselves in a corner in some cases. So we're constantly out there educating and training and making sure that they're doing the things in the best practices way. We actually have contests on a quarterly basis on the best design, and the partners really get into it. They love the sort of competition. They want their compelling, award-winning solutions to be recognized by Sitecore. So they give us their sites and their designs, and we can help understand how they can get better, how they can improve. So that's a lot of the kind of programs we're doing right now, and we're continuously adding what we call success services for customers and for partners to help them understand how to better implement.
Great. Thanks, Darren. Scott, back to you.
Okay, let's move on to question 5 here. So that's around what I'm calling engagement in a box. And for fear of using the WEM term, I'm going to do it. For those of you who are out there tweeting to me already, don't do it, don't do it. I just did it. So talking about web engagement management, specifically, the thing that I hear and the thing that I actually see, so I'm pretty much on record as being an advocate of web engagement management, but not as a product. I think of it as a process. And I think that there are very few companies out there who I think warrant actually using that term, WEM, in place of WCM. I think a lot of people have just changed their name because it's kind of the acronym of the day, but they don't necessarily deserve it. I actually think that because the way that Sitecore has been built out, you actually might be one of the few that do deserve it. But here's my worry about that. In my experience, there are far fewer customers who are actually realizing this topic, that they are actually personalizing and implementing these sorts of kind of true one-to-one engagement out there. but I see Sitecore really wearing that on their sleeve and really pushing it hard. And when I've had customers who are looking to the prospective Sitecore customers look to that product, they have felt like you guys have been kind of really overselling that notion of engagement, even when they just really want to have web content management. Are they just not the right customer for you, or is it something different? Help me understand your thought on that.
Well, so first of all, I'll say that I don't like the word web engagement management for one simple reason. The focus is on the wrong thing. It's not about web anything. It's about the customer. You know, Patty Siebel said it best. It's the customer, stupid. And I think that, so we focus on the customer. And that's the first thing that you got to put the customer in the middle. And what does the customer want? And how does the customer want to be communicated with? Because the web and email and all this stuff, it's just communications. Community, social, it's just communications. They want to be talked to. They want to be engaged. And I think so putting a customer in the center is the first thing. Now, for that customer who feels like I just want a website, that's fine. You can start with that. Start with the web, but they're going to eventually need more. So why a lot of customers, even if they're not ready for it yet, they buy Sitecore because they one day want to. And they realize that it's not just about publishing web pages anymore. It's about getting business results from these, these customer interactions. And I think that's the other focus that we really have is it's not just about the channel, the web being the channel or the mobile channel. It's about trying to find ways to drive your business, whether you're a government organization or you're a nonprofit or you're commercial. It's about getting better business results. So I think even if they're not ready for it, they like the fact that the stuff is there for when they are. They can turn it on when they want it. And I'd say the last point to your question was, how do you get there? And we've been working on all sorts of methodology because I agree with you that it is much about the process. It's actually more about the people. And the technology is just an enabler. And so we're working on tons of methodology on how to just maximize your business and how you can get more value from this stuff, as opposed to just building a bunch of manuals on how to implement this stuff.
Can you give us a sense of the percentages maybe of the folks? Because I buy that, but I'd love to revisit this in a year or a year and a half and see if, in fact, those customers who bought it with the kind of long-term needs in mind, if they ever actually do get there. Do you have a sense of, A, how long that tends to take? Has that happened where somebody kind of bought you when the product was bigger than they were ready for, but they've since grown into it? And 2, can you give us an overall sense of what the % of your customers who actually kind of are doing it for all that it's capable of doing? I don't mean to make you know what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fair question, right? So I think everyone buys Sitecore, whether they buy everything or they just buy the WCM. They always start with the web project, right? So right out of the gate, you're going to do that first, right? So that's that's 4 months, 6 months sometimes, depends on how much they want to do, and then they start thinking about this, right? They get that up and running. The nice thing is a lot of the stuff is just literally you can turn it on. Right? You don't have to do any implementation. You can literally just switch it on when you're ready to. So some of them start to do that very simply. And then they incrementally add more stuff. They'll add email. They'll start doing some multivariate testing. And they literally incrementally do. So we actually have a maturity model that we talk about how to do this stuff a bite at a time because it can be daunting. There's so much of this stuff that you can do and where do you start? So a lot of these folks do that. I would say right now that we have customers either actively deployed or are implementing. Probably it's about in the sort of crossing the chasm model. Those sort of early adopter phase, like 5% are the ones actively really thinking about this. But I would say that in my conversations with all these large organizations and even mid-market organizations, a lot of them are really thinking about it now. I mean, they're all realizing that we need to create consistency in our interactions with our customer. Because that is shown, research is showing that is the most important thing to customer loyalty is the consistency.
Whoops. Is that me or did we lose Darren? Hello?
I think we lost him. I don't hear him either.
Okay.
His phone.
All right. Well, hopefully while he fixes that, we will turn over. Veronica, do you have a question from the audience, or shall I turn over to Brian on this topic?
You go right ahead to Brian right now. Okay,
great. So Brian, let's give you a chance to jump back in here on the notion of web engagement. So, we've talked about it being more of a process than a technology. But what I worry about from Drupal's standpoint is if prospects of yours are out there kind of buying that larger push, they're listening to the evangelization, they're hearing about I want to create this personalized experience, can Drupal really help business folks achieve that objective? I think I want to understand specifically its ability to kind of capture these progressive profiles, move that along, allowing marketers to score content and target specific audiences. Those are capabilities that I've heard are kind of lacking in the Drupal product from customers, that they have more difficulty with that. Is it an appropriate solution for that idea?
Well, so I think the question is whether or not you can achieve those business objectives with Drupal as your CMS. And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, then the second piece of that would be, would you use Drupal to do some of the things that you just described: personalization, content scoring, tracking behavior? And in that case, the answer is in many cases no. One of the nice things, and this comes from my background previously, is rather than try to be all things to all people, a lot of what the Drupal community does is focuses on what it does really well, and then has a very rich API set. And then again, this is where modules come in, integrations with other tools to allow them to do what they do best. So there are modules that are available today and people utilizing Drupal with Omniture, with Google Analytics, with social monitoring tools like Radian6, with marketing automation tools. For instance, on Acquia.com, we have use a tool, Manticore. Some of our customers are utilizing Drupal with Eloqua, with Marketo, and some of those tools. And what we recommend to customers is a best-of-breed approach, where they utilize sort of loosely coupled integrations with the tools that are designed for their particular job. And Drupal is absolutely capable of facilitating that and providing those integrations so that way you can create these experiences. Now, Acquia as a company, one of the things that we're working on right now is a distribution similar to Acquia Commons focused on this market. Whether we call it web engagement management or channel optimization remains to be seen. But again, that'll be a mechanism to streamline and give customers or users an advanced starting point to achieve these business objectives. But they'll be able to use the tools that they already have in place and not sort of have to pay a double tax, if you will, pay for tools, from quote-unquote Acquia, and then still retain and have to use Omniture or other advanced web analytics tools or other pieces in addition to paying for us. So we think that loosely coupled architecture is best, and every organization goes through systems where they buy it for one reason and it doesn't quite meet their needs. They want to be able to swap those in and out very easily. And so rather than having that all be part of Drupal, I think there's a great opportunity sort of for loosely coupled integrations here to help organizations be more agile.
So I think by the way, do we have, Darren, are you back?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we got you now.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
All right.
So I want to follow back up with Brian. I just wanted to check to see if I can come to you next. But so Brian, I think my worry there was, so I definitely hear that notion that there are some kind of tangential, or not tangential, rather that web engagement is not just dependent on web content management, but that there are other capabilities that need to be present. You mentioned social, you mentioned analytics, you mentioned a couple of others, right? So I hear that kind of taking this best-of-breed approach, you act as kind of the hub-spoke model and work with a number of other tools. I think that's a very valid approach. I think I was more worried about specifically on personalization that the customers that I've spoken with who are challenged with their Drupal implementations are more about the underlying content architecture, which I don't think we need to, I guess, go into today. I don't know that we've got that audience that cares a lot about that, but that personalization itself is a challenge, not the integration with the other periphery tools, but that the notion of personalizing content and driving one towards each and having that kind of one-to-one capability is more lacking in the framework of the tool. Do you want to speak to that generally without getting too technical? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not the right person to get into the deep technical specifics of that. But as I said, we're investigating this right now, and I certainly have not heard of any fundamental architectural blockers that would prevent someone from doing this. We've got a solution architect and an engineering team to helping investigate the solution, and we're working with customers who are either doing this today with Drupal or looking to build alongside to build these solutions in the very near future. So suffice to say, I'd be very surprised if there's an architectural limitation, but that's the kind of thing where Acquia, as a commercial organization, can help someone who is struggling with that to figure out what's the best approach.
Got it. Okay, Darren, now that you're back, any more thoughts on this subject?
Sure. Yeah, I think you guys can still hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, good. So I think one of the things one of the reasons we did analytics early on was from the information collection side of things, because how can you personalize if you don't understand? I think, Scott, you said many times, that whole idea of perceptive content, right? You need to be able to perceive before you can persuade. And so how, the thing I look at and I say, how can you not collect this kind of analytics? Because if you're not listening to the customer, if you're not understanding what they're doing, who they are, where they're from, those kinds of things that typically is the domain of a web analytics vendor. If you're not doing that, how can you target content? How can you understand that customer? And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons why we've gone down this road of doing a lot of that. We still integrate too, and I think that's important. But if you can't understand your customer, you're going to have an awfully difficult time trying to persuade them or guide them or nurture them or all that kind of stuff we do in the marketing world.
Gotcha. Great. Okay, good point. And thanks for bringing that, giving me a little plug there. Do we have questions from the audience, Veronica, or shall we move on to question 6?
Yep, you can keep going. We're keeping an eye on the time, and we're moving right through.
Okay, got it. Great. So the next topic, Brian, is back to you. Steering the ship is what we've called this. So I think a question for many of my customers about open source, and specifically I want to talk about, again, using that term, the enterprise customers, right? Their concern about open source is that no one's steering the ship, right? And who's steering the ship? Who can I call? Who can I hold accountable? I think a nice advantage of that commercial open source model, which I'm not suggesting that you have, but is that they can seemingly have the best of both worlds, or there's an organization that sets the strategy, guides the ship, and they can use the community to help with the product itself. But with Drupal, though, it is a project. And so I've heard you and Dries both, Dries being the founder, talk about orienting Drupal towards the enterprise. But how do you do that with a project like that? And is Acquia actually the ones who are setting the roadmap and steering the ship?
So I just want to be very, very clear here. Acquia is not setting the roadmap for Drupal. Acquia is not steering, actively steering the ship. That's not our role in the Drupal ecosystem and in the Drupal community. We're one of many companies that contribute to Drupal. We have 4 or 5 of the top 30 contributors to Drupal 7 core. So we're very, very active. We have things that we find important to our enterprise customers that we advocate very strongly for. But we by no means steer the ship or are proscriptive to the community, nor do we really want to be. I think, at the end of the day, in the Drupal community, and I believe in open source in general, is that code talks. And I don't think that's really, at the end of the day, probably that much different than any other software development world. And so a lot of what happens is developers, whether they work at web development shops, whether they work at large organizations, write code to scratch their own itch, to solve problems, to optimize performance, to achieve their business objectives. Now, what happens in the open source world is you get the benefit of collective behavior by contributing that code back to the community and letting others see it. The more eyes that see the code, the better in quality it's going to get over time, because more people are using it, and more people are contributing to the issue queue, and it's going to accelerate development. what we'll do is we look at areas where that are maybe thornier problems that are outside the scope of potentially a web development project or a website creation project, and we look to see if we can invest resources to address those. We invested a lot for a community project around usability and user experience on the administration side in Drupal with Drupal 7. Acquia funded it, but it was a project that was completely managed in the community, and it was all given back to the community. It's all available for anyone to use. We're always looking for places where we can contribute that way, because that benefits the entire community overall. Software development on tools, whether it's Drupal or Sitecore or any product, it's an evolving thing. You don't get everything out of the in version 1, and so we want to contribute in the places that we see that have the most value for our customers, but we're just one of many contributors in the Drupal community.
So I'm glad you clarified that, but I have two responses to that. One, which is one of skepticism. And I know that is technically the relationship, but the skepticism comes from, I was at a conference back in May, a great conference actually, give it a little plug, CMS Expo, where Dries was speaking, and I remember we were having a late night thing. I think Drupal 7 might have just been out, or maybe 8, something.
That's right.
And he made a mention, 7, right? So he made mention of like having just accepted 6,000 contributions or something. Well, if he's the one kind of accepting or denying, I guess is the other way, isn't that kind of in fact? I mean, I realized they were all just contributed, and maybe that was with all intentions, there was no request for contributions, but by way of the ability and the power to accept or deny contributions, doesn't that
Sure.
mean that you're guiding the ship?
So I mean, you bring up a unique situation that Dries, the individual, is in, and
Okay.
he's been very open and transparent about this situation. Dries is the project founder and lead of the Drupal project. He wears his Drupal hat. That's his primary hat that he wears. He created this in 1999. He open sourced it in 2001. He's been doing this for 10 years. He also saw that for Drupal to grow and evolve, he felt he needed to create an organization similar to Red Hat, similar to Canonical, a commercial vendor to address the gap in the market around support. The support question that gets brought up by so many proprietary vendors, Sitecore included, about what do we do about this open source code? The fact that there are many billion-dollar open source companies, Red Hat specifically and MySQL, seems to sort of pass through the radar. However, I think Dries is incredibly careful about this. He does it in an open, transparent way. As in the office of the CTO, he's not driving product direction for Acquia, but he's very involved in that, and he works very closely with our entire leadership team. But ultimately, his credibility as an individual, his credibility as a leader, and as a personality at large in the technology world, is based on his ability to walk that line and do so in a way that doesn't undermine the project. This is something that I know he talks about a lot, and it's critical to him. And so, is it a reality? Absolutely. But he's very open and blogs about it all the time in terms of, what this means to do these two jobs simultaneously.
Sure. Okay, that's fair. Then I have the other side of the coin, and I'm sorry, I'll go to you there in just one second, but I feel like this is a strong counter to the point, Brian, that you made then is, okay, if Acquia then is not steering the ship, technicalities or whatever aside, if that's not the case, then the question from my customers is still the same, which is, then who do I hold accountable? Is that in fact a legitimate knock for an enterprise customer that in the case of Drupal, if they were to try to go that way, that they don't really have anyone to hold accountable from the product's perspective? Certainly I know on the services side, but isn't that a difficult situation then for them?
Well, but I think there's a paradigm shift. So, in the proprietary world, you buy the software and oftentimes, the organization will commit to things on their product roadmap in order to get the deal done. Like, we really need this feature in order to do this. If you guys could do this and it's on the roadmap, we'll do it to get it done. You know, there's a shift in the open source world. You don't have that commitment, and you don't have the next customer in the deal that's driving the roadmap because you have access to the source code. So there is no, if you need something to happen in the Drupal world, it's a critical business requirement and you need a particular technology, then you can write it yourself. You have the tools and the ability to go solve your own problem, scratch your own itch. That's where a lot of innovation, frankly, happens in the Drupal world. You know, there was another vendor, not one on our call today, that released a Facebook module in May and made a big deal about it. You know, we looked at Drupal.org. The first Facebook module for Drupal came out in 2007. There's tens of modules available for Facebook, and they're used on more than 7,000 sites. You're not waiting for a vendor to build it and then hold accountable. When are you going to build that Facebook module? You can just go build one. And I think that's the change or the shift that organizations that are choosing open source and Drupal embrace and, frankly, value, as opposed to arguing with a vendor about what the roadmap looks like.
Fair enough.
And Scott,
Okay.
I'm going to dive in right there because I know you want to go to Darren, but just before that, I've got a question from the audience for Brian. They are asking, security of our members' data is high priority for us. How does Drupal handle security?
Well, I think Drupal has a security team. We have documented processes on how the community responds to security vulnerabilities, how it mitigates risks and communicates with that, and it takes a very open approach to that. So if a security vulnerability is found for Drupal core or a module, there's a mitigation process to close the vulnerability. There's a communication process and a software update process so that way patches are available to site owners to resolve that vulnerability, and they do so in a very open, very efficient way. And it's really security through transparency is really the philosophy here. But at the end of the day, the proof's in the pudding. Drupal powers whitehouse.gov. Now, I don't have any hard statistics, but I guarantee that, or I feel very strongly that whitehouse.gov is probably one of the most attacked websites in the world from a hacker perspective. And Drupal does just fine serving whitehouse.gov. It's been running it for a number of years. So if it's good enough for the White House from a security perspective, and obviously that's a critical concern, I think it can do very well in any highly secure scenario.
I just want to publicly congratulate you, Brian, for waiting 58 full minutes to bring up whitehouse.gov. That's amazing. I always hear the whitehouse.gov reference. I can't believe it took that long. If we had only had an hour-long show, we might not have even gotten to it. That's amazing. Anyways, I'm just teasing. Veronica, if not, or shall I go back on the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. You go right ahead.
All right, Darren, let's bring you back in here. So let's talk about services, something that you mentioned earlier. So, if it's not obvious to the audience, at this point, that we want to be really clear that there's no system, there's no web content management, web engagement management, whatever you want to call it, system that necessarily solves your business problem out of the box, right? So, in fact, a lot, if not most of that success is really dependent on the implementers and their ability to kind of understand the organization, audience, find the balance between complexity and ease of use, et cetera, right? So, all of that being said, Darren, since Sitecore doesn't offer professional services, and correct me if I'm wrong there, then how do you ensure that your implementations are in fact sound? And how can I, as a prospective customer, hold you, Sitecore, accountable if you're not also able to do my implementation?
So let me correct a little bit of what you just said, and that is that Sitecore does have professional services. What Sitecore doesn't do is what I call priming the deal. So what Sitecore is not going to do is come in and implement your website on Sitecore and do all the work as the prime vendor. What we will do is we have what I call my ninja squad that you can parachute in and work with you, work with your team, and make sure that or take on some of the trickier extensions to the product that you want to do, all those types of things, that's where Sitecore plays, and we make sure that for large enterprise vendors like that very large coffee company in Seattle, we had teams in and out of there helping them architect, making sure that it's performing the way they want it to perform. We do that every day on all these large organizations, companies like General Mills, companies like Computer Associates. We do this all the time. Now, the one thing I will say is, I've certainly worked with vendors over the years. I've worked for vendors. I've worked with vendors. And the one thing I've seen happen time and time again is that vendor that starts to look at that professional services and starts to cannibalize their channel. And what happens is, it looks so easy and it looks so good to start doing that services. And what the vendors always forget is that those projects are so much bigger than just your software. What we find is system integrators and web design agencies and even marketing service providers, they have a much better view on the scope of what needs to happen. They understand how your software plugs into all the other packages, how it integrates with CRM systems, for instance, how it integrates with the web analytics. As a vendor, I understand my software really well, but I do not necessarily understand all these other technologies really well, and I think that's where the advantage of working with partners comes from. These guys do this every day, and they absolutely understand how this stuff needs to be integrated. And I think that's why Sitecore sticks to its guns and doesn't try and compete with our channel.
And Scott, I'm going to dive in there because, Darren, we're going to keep you on the hot seat. We've got a question from Twitter basically comparing Sitecore and Drupal. Drupal has a large base in the smaller biz nonprofit sector. The question is, does Sitecore have any interest in building that market, and how do you intend to do that?
I think our focus is on mid-market and enterprise. I think while SMB is interesting, I think we're gonna stick to our knitting. That's not to say we don't have small customers. Will it be a market segment I attack directly over the next couple of years? Probably not. But we do have customers that in that smaller category. But as a focus, no. I think the whole idea of a platform, the whole idea of how Sitecore is architected, we're really targeting that, that global 2,000 and even upper mid-market customers. I think that's very much our destiny over the next couple of years and our focus.
All right, great. That definitely answers the question for our listener. Thank you. And Scott, back to you.
Okay, Darren, you're not done yet. You brought it up. Let's talk about customer experience management. So you call it at Sitecore, you call it a customer experience platform, you said, right? You corrected me when I talked about web engagement and said that essentially it really is all about the customers. So we've had this conversation before, but I think that, again, I said I'm annoyed, frankly, with many products that start to, they're web content management vendors. They suddenly like to just call themselves WEM vendors because that gets them some kudos, I guess. I dislike that. I give you guys a pass, though, because of all that you do encompass. Now, however, moving to this customer engagement wave, I'm seeing that as a trend as well, right? So I'm not the only one. There are 4 or 5 companies that are now out there starting to talk about customer engagement. It was written up in the Forrester wave as if it's synonymous with web content management, and it's not. So unfortunately here, I don't think we just get to decide what customer engagement management is. There actually is customer experience management. There actually is that's a term that's been long used, and I think there's a big difference between customer experience and web experience management. I wonder if you can tell me, and I'm not quite sure that I'm sold yet, that you guys should be kind of allowed to wear that moniker, but I want you to convince me. Can you tell me what the differences are, and then can you tell me what has changed about the platform to allow you to kind of now wear that badge?
Fair enough. So let's just take that head on, right? What is experience? Experience is shared memory, right? Your experiences and how you feel is really a result of how someone made you feel. It's the old saying that people remember some of what you say, more of what you do, and everything about how you make them feel. What we do in terms of that is really this notion of the conversation. I have an interaction with you. I come to the website. That website should remember me the next time and maybe keep that conversation moving forward. Maybe pick up where we left off. Just like you and I have a conversation, and the next time we talk, I remember the last thing we talked about. I remember you have, a couple of kids. I remember you've got a newborn baby, and I keep that conversation and I move it forward. The same thing happens now across channel. Whether it's on a mobile device, whether I send you an email, that email should recognize that we've had this conversation, that you're interested in these types of these types of topics. It would be very strange if I walked up to you after knowing you for years and just shake your hand and introduce myself like we'd never met. And that's yet what we do all the time on the web. That's what we do every day in email when we don't really think about the customer experience. We don't listen to the things we know about that customer in a CRM system. Why wouldn't we use everything we know about that customer and interact with them in an appropriate way across all these different channels? That is why we talk about customer experience and this consistency of customer experience and that consistency of that conversation, and that matters to customers because at the end of the day, these people want you to treat them consistently. And I'll tell you a little story. One of our customers is Alaska Airlines. I'm one of their frequent flyers. I called them up and I wanted to talk about a flight I had next week. Well, because I'm one of their frequent flyers, my cell phone, using my cell phone, it rings right to a call center operator. Don't even have to punch my PIN code in because they know my cell phone number. And so they immediately route me to the right person. And she says, "Hello, Mr. Granaccia, are you calling about your flight to Boston next week?" I about dropped the phone. But it immediately had this huge grin on my face and said, that is exactly the experience I want. I want you to recognize me as an important customer, and I want you to treat me that way. I want you to continue that conversation. And I think that's what it's really about.
Okay, so let me challenge. Oops, I'm sorry.
So did I convince you?
Yeah, well, no, actually you didn't, because here's the thing. To me, that's the definition of web engagement management. And so we can go crazy about having debates on the word, even using the term web, right? Web experience management. Maybe it should have been digital, it should have been online, something else, because web is too, I think, too small for this, since it does go on to email, etc. But nonetheless, it's still, I'm focused on the word customer because you specifically changed that word. And customer to me, you know, if I'm trying to buy a product on Best Buy and I do all my research for it, I definitely agree that I want you to tell me more about it the next time. I want you to learn the types of things that I like. But here's the problem that I have. When I do my research online, and then I go into the store and I go buy that product, and then I come back online, you're still trying to sell it to me as if I don't already own it. Why? Because you're viewing me as a prospect, not as a customer. And in my mind, true customer experience management, again, if we're getting literal about terms, and customer experience management is already out there. It's long before WCM. There are systems that do some of this stuff. It's really more about kind of that integration of CRM with all of those back office applications to understand, you know, service, you know, you support and services and all those types of things. What about the product has changed to evolve into some of those things that beyond just prospect management and beyond the domain of the marketer, you're actually managing relationships with customers?
Well, I think it all comes down to blending the online world with the offline world. This is exactly why we've created integrations with CRM systems. Because in your Best Buy example, what I would say is you did some research, you went into the store, you bought that TV, you swiped your loyalty card. I know that you bought that TV. You come to the website, you've logged in because you want to, you know, you get your loyalty points. And now I recognize you bought that TV, and now I've got a nurture program that sends you an email about getting the most value out of that TV purchase. And every time you come to the website, there's a couple of new articles about how to calibrate that TV and how to set up that surround sound system and all that stuff to continue to add value to you as a customer. And it's about blending those channels and being consistent. So it's still the same thing. And it's centered on what does that customer need and how can we nurture them across their entire customer life cycle.
Okay. We can take this debate on another time. I think we got to move on. But so next question, is it Veronica? Can I move on, or are there other questions?
Absolutely, you go right ahead.
All right, Brian, back to you. You're back on the hot seat. I got a cynics question for you, as if these other ones weren't already. So I wanted
to. Great for you, Scott.
I like this. So Acquia Cloud, I'll give you a little plug. This is something you guys are pushing. I saw I saw a presentation that you just did the other day on this. I'd like to hear about that, but I wonder, here's my cynical take on it. A couple of things. Number one is I definitely do hear an awful lot more questions from enterprise organizations asking me about, cloud capabilities and web content management systems in the cloud. I don't see as many buying, but I do see a lot of inquiries about it. So I'm intrigued that you're moving in that direction, and I wonder about your, how that's fared for you. Here's my cynicism, though. I actually did go and look up. There's an awful, I don't know the source of this, but it was sent to me, so validate it. There is a high percentage of folks who are on Drupal who are still on version 6 and are having trouble migrating to 7 and then on, right? And I have a feeling that a lot of that has to do with those customizations and that migration path isn't extremely clear. I wonder if your shift towards the cloud isn't to help solve some of that problem, that now if you're in a pass mode, don't you, in effect, help yourselves with that problem?
So does cloud help the Drupal 6 to 7 migration? Is that the question?
Not cloud, but pass. If you're doing platform as a service, okay, then you don't need, so the pass side of it, sorry, not the cloud.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So so those two issues are completely unrelated. So okay, when we do platform as a service, our cloud is optimized for Drupal, not for Drupal 6, not for Drupal 7. In fact, you can run both Drupal 6 or 7 websites in our cloud, and we have a one-click install if you want to start from the base distribution Drupal core of each one of those. The configuration and tuning come in the flavor of the PHP memory, the CPU memory that's available, the pre-configured LAMP stack in an HA fully redundant environment or a single server environment. It's the configuration of Varnish, Nginx, Memcache, APC, highly available file system, all out of the box in our Cloud Pass environment. So we are indifferent to which version of Drupal you run in our cloud. Our cloud is configured for Drupal. Now, in Drupal 6, there was a distribution called PressFlow that was a number of tweaks to Drupal core to enable it to perform better in high traffic, high volume environments with database redundancy. And so that is what we recommend for our high-traffic websites in our cloud platform. Many of those tweaks have migrated into Drupal 7 core, and this is how things evolve in the Drupal community. Important technical code or popular code that's utilized on the vast majority of sites has an opportunity to move into core, so then it upgrades with core. So we don't necessarily need the PressFlow distribution for sites that are running on Drupal 7 because they already get all the benefits built into Drupal 7 itself. But there's no distinction between 6 or 7. Now, the migration question around 6 versus 7 is something that any platform vendor or any platform product, I should say, has. It was something we had at Documentum. I'm sure we weren't alone there. I'm sure other ECM vendors had it. Is you have the core or the primary product, and then you have lots and lots of pieces, whether it's the 10,000 modules, whether it's other product lines like digital asset management or workflow that all need to move up and support that new core. And the world is full of limitless possibility and limited resources. And so those things take time. So the Drupal community and in Contrib is upgrading their modules. Just in the last probably 3 months, we've seen 100,000 new sites launch and ping back to Drupal.org on Drupal 7. So this is a process. It takes time. It's not, there's nothing unique about it in the Drupal world, but it's certainly something that that's just going on. That's a part of software evolution and software major releases of new platforms.
Okay, so I just want to be clear because, yeah, Veronica, 1 second. Let me clarify. I'll let you jump in there. So I just want to clarify. My apologies, folks. So it's not a SaaS offering. I'm thinking SaaS and saying PaaS. So you do not, in fact, have a software as a service offering. Is that right, Brian?
Well, no. So just
that's also wrong.
We do also offer a SaaS platform called Drupal Garden. So it's very similar to WordPress.com. It's a completely browser-based experience. We manage the code. That is built on Drupal 7.
Okay, so
Okay,
that's...
Brian, hopefully this will further clarify, because I've got a question from the audience. So is the cloud really not a SaaS, but more of a virtualization of managed hosting?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the terms. In our case, Acquia Cloud, it's built on Amazon Web Services, and it's a virtualized environment tuned and optimized for Drupal. I had a partner tell me at DrupalCon in London a few weeks ago that by deploying sites on our cloud, they eliminate 2 weeks of a project time that they have to bill clients building that environment, because we build it for them and give it to them out of the box. So the value is really speed to deployment and then configuration. We're hosting more than 400 sites in our cloud, so we've experienced on all types of sites rather than pushing that down to whether it be the web development shop, whether it be the site owner. They get the benefit of our collective experience across all those sites.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Hopefully that answered the question. And I know, Scott, we got to move on, so back to you.
Okay, with about 15 minutes to spare, moving on to question 8. I think we're right on time here. So proprietary emulations, I had this thought. So at that same plug number 2, by the way, if you're out there listening, a CMS Expo at that conference, it was a great conference. I keynoted there, Dries keynoted there. I was really psyched to hear, and I actually mentioned it in mine, that in response to a question, Dries answered, the question was essentially what kind of, so many of the vendors at that particular conference were other open source vendors, right? Or open source.
Correct.
And the question was asked from the audience, kind of what can you guys learn from each other, and how much sharing goes back and forth between you founders and all that kind of stuff, right? And Dries's answer, which I really liked, and as well as I like your take on this, your being Drupal's take on this, is that we really should, it's not necessarily as much about how much we should learn from each other in the open source world, but what we should learn from the proprietary vendors, because they've got a hold on a lot of things that are kind of important and relevant to the enterprise, and that's really where we need to move. And I agree with that at the highest level, but I wonder if you could tell us about some of the things that Drupal or Acquia, I know you're kind of speaking on both behalves, what you guys have learned from some of the proprietary vendors, maybe like Sitecore, that you either have already emulated or plan to emulate. What has changed given this kind of a relatively new mantra?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think what we do and what we see is vendors of all types, whether they're open source or they're proprietary, influence buying behavior, customer expectations on what they are trying to achieve with their web properties. And, particularly, Darren mentioned the market that Sitecore is focused on, and we're focused on a very similar thing. We think about it as the global 10,000, if you will, Acquia the company. And so, we see, vendors influence those that market's perception of what they need. And so, a lot of what we do is understand those market requirements, and then figure out what is that a place where we want to play? Is that a place where we don't want to play? What's the product offering? What's the how do we approach that and deliver value to customers there? I think web engagement management, as I mentioned, is a perfect example of that. This is something that's ongoing now that we see over the next 6 to 12 months, where customers are increasingly asking about this. I was on a call last week that was, how do you guys use marketing automation turned into, we want to use Drupal plus Eloqua plus Radian 6 integrated into Salesforce. How would we do that? I'm sure that Sitecore's efforts and the other vendors that you mentioned in the Forrester Wave for CXM, they're influencing the market. We think there's opportunity there. That also happened with us with our Commons distribution for Drupal. We saw incredible demand and activity in the social business software space. And we said, hey, there's incredible communities built on Drupal, Semantic Connect, NVIDIA's communities, there's public sector ones. They're all over the place, but they were all built in a bespoke fashion, custom from the ground up. If we package this together in a distribution, does it make it easier for enterprise buyers, and does it bring Drupal to people who wouldn't necessarily consider it, to going back to where we started, which is the business buyer versus tech buyer. And so I think what we look to, the things that we look at from proprietary vendors is how they package their technologies into solutions, and we evaluate whether that's a fit for Drupal, and then would our business and would Drupal benefit our partners and others for going after that market.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting. I think that's good. Now I'm going to ask Darren. I'm going to ask you the same thing. If we can move on to the next slide for Darren. Same question for you. Go ahead. What have you learned? What does Sitecore look to the open source world for?
Well, I think that the whole we have a shared source community, so it's not fully open source, but it emulates that same concept, right? So we have over 150 or 160 last count modules, tools, applications that people have developed and given to the community. We build a lot of them ourselves and give them away to the community, and then we also take things that come from the community and grow them and extend them. And so we've done the same thing. I think there's a lot to be learned by that sort of crowdsourcing model, and I think we've really picked up on that. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing we've taken away, is that the community likes to, and you learn a lot from your community. So we spend a lot of time in our community, the Sitecore Developer Network, listening to our customers, our MVPs, and I think that's the thing we've taken away.
Great. Okay. Speeding up a little bit to go to the next question, which is, to me, the big elephant in the room in terms of the differences between these two things that folks wear on their sleeves, at least in the open source community, is that, why pay that upfront fee, Darren, for the licensing cost when you're going to have to pay for services anyway? That's kind of the open source moniker, is, why pay for the software itself? So to you then, let's talk about that total cost of ownership. So help us understand, if you can, give us some specifics in terms of maybe typical price points, or give us some understanding of pricing if you can. And then help me understand the ratio, I guess, of services to price for typical implementations. I hate the word typical, but I don't know another way to phrase it.
Yeah, there's no such thing. But our pricing is very simple. It's servers and concurrent users, right? That's really, at the end of the day, it comes down to how big is that site got to be, how many people you got to support. The pricing. Instead of answering on the pricing, I'll go back to this. It's a pretty well accepted fact that in software and in WCM in general, the software cost is 5% of the total project cost. That's been true since I started in this stuff in 1997. Doing broad vision, and it's been true, and it's still true today. So the question I always ask customers is, you're trying to make that 5% a smaller number, and it's been my experience, and it's been my partner's experience, because this is what they tell me, that and I'll pick on Drupal because I just finished a white paper with a partner who their experience, mind you, that's just one partner's experience. They said 2.5x. 2.5x more time, money, expense to do Drupal over Sitecore. Sitecore lets me go faster, it's quicker. And so I asked the customer, look, if you're going to try and squeeze this 5% number to 4% or 0, but you've now ballooned the 95% of that budget, does that work? Does that math really work out for you? Because Sitecore ranges anywhere from, it can be as small as 15, 20 grand. It could be as big as multi-millions. And we've had pricing all the way in that gamut. So at the end of the day, if that's going to cost you 2.5 times more to implement, I really have to question that. And you hear stories about these massive teams of open source developers and how much time and the cost of getting painted into a corner. And I shake my head and say, I don't think that's the right answer. But that's, of course, I'd say that because I'm the proprietary vendor.
So I'm going to let Brian respond in just a second, but let me just get a ratio from you. So what you're saying is, aside from the fact of, the service is inflating if you go open source, and I'll let Brian answer that, but for you specifically, you said it can go from 15 grand to millions. Let's take a scenario where we've got a $100,000 licensing cost. What should I expect? I think when you're saying your 5% or basically the whole 20 times notion, you're talking about over the life of owning the product. Is that
over
right?
the life.
Not implementation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about
because no one's
itself. What's that?
It's one of those things like how long's a piece of string, right? But I've seen projects as fast as a month. Comcast, .com, their first site went up in 4 weeks. So costs vary wildly depending on ambition and what they want to do. But if you're looking for the actual software to services ratio, it can be anywhere from 1 to 1 to 2 to 1. It's so all over the board.
Right, and that's because of the scope of what they're trying to do is so all over the board, and whether they're ready to adopt kind of you guys wholeheartedly, like you said, or whether they plan to grow into it a little bit, right? So yeah. I get that, but in terms of when you look at, do you have experience based on this though? That do your services providers tell you that typical ratio is a 2 to 1, 3 to 1? Is that appropriate to guesstimate?
Well, I'd say it's probably 1 to 1 to 2 to 1 okay. in most cases.
Okay. Moving quickly over to Brian. Thanks for that, Darren. Brian, answer that. I can't phrase it any better than Darren.
Yeah. Sure. So I'm really glad that you guys brought up the white paper because I was a big fan of the white paper. I learned a lot. It makes me also wonder what I have to do as Acquia to get Darren and Sitecore to recognize me in sort of my existence, because the entire white paper is really talking about how there is no support for open source in Drupal very specifically throughout the white paper, but yet I as a company have raised almost $40 million. I have 1,000 customers and I've been around for 3 years and are often mentioned in all the same reports. So it's hard to believe that in the 2011 that someone did a Drupal project and they don't know that we exist. But that's a different topic entirely. I am surprised, though, about the 5% figure, because, Scott, as you rightly mentioned, that means there's a 20 to $1 ratio in services for every dollar in software. And in the white paper specifically, it says CMS software costs typically comprise 5% of the total implementation. So this is really the implementation ratio, or at least it's how it's presented here in the white paper. This is, ironically, much different in the Drupal world. Whether it be the Acquia portion or what have you. We're used to seeing sort of the 3 to 4 services to quote unquote software dollars on implementation projects. I'm not sure about this specific project for Agency Q and why the dollars were so much more expensive for Drupal, but what we found is from an implementation perspective with customers, I mentioned the one with the migration and the upgrade for a community software product to be very comparable to proprietary solutions and really kind of a wash in deals. And so when we think of the 3 components in a software project, there's the software license costs, the implementation costs, and then the support and maintenance costs. What we find is that Drupal versus proprietary solutions are very much in the same game, or a wash, if you will. The license dollars are something that stay in your pocket, and then because our maintenance costs aren't as a percentage of our license costs, they're certainly much more cost-effective, or along the lines of what you'd pay in support and maintenance over the life of your site, as you would with proprietary technologies.
So it's really, I mean, you made the reference back to, Acquia, and I know we've got to wrap up here. We're pretty much at time. Well, let me just leave it at that then. That's enough there. We offered you guys one last question to each other. Do we have time, Veronica, to take that, or should we?
Absolutely. You know what? Our audience is going crazy. We got lots of questions coming in. They are loving this debate. So let's get these guys asking each other a question.
Okay, so I warned you, Brian and Darren. I told you guys in advance you're going to get the opportunity to ask each other one question at the end here. So Darren shot one across the bow. Brian, your turn.
Well, I think I just asked my question was, what do I have to do to get my peer Darren and our peers at Sitecore to recognize Acquia? You know, they released a very well written white paper all about open source and Drupal, but the existence of a very large company in this space providing commercial support seems to have escaped the writer. So what do I have to do to get you guys to recognize that we exist?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I think the problem is that you aren't Drupal, though. And I think at the end of the day, the customer has to make that decision. That yes, they can hire you, but they can hire a partner. They can hire any partner. Agency Q clearly didn't feel like they could use you guys for whatever reason. I don't know why. But I think it's an important point that not everyone's going to use Acquia. And at that point, there's a lot of risks. And I think a lot of our partners tried to go down that road and lost their shorts on projects. And I think the question would be why? Why didn't they use you? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an important point to consider.
Well, I don't think Red Hat isn't Linux, but it hasn't hurt their business not being Linux. So, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Darren, and then to you. You get the last question here of the day.
Yeah, you know, my question is this, and we talked a little bit about this, but you know, I was doing some research for this session, and you know, I came across this Drupal crisis blog post about the rising major bugs and how the number of major bugs have doubled over the last couple of months, and there seems to be this, you know, in the developer community, particularly just in Drupal core, there seems to be a lot of concern about just how many more bugs are being introduced. And I guess I just leave it at that. How can an open source community really tackle that? You've got a lot of varied, skilled people contributing this stuff and a ton of major bugs, 22,000 last I counted. I mean, how do you deal with that as a community?
So no, that's a good question. So we're very familiar with the Drupal crisis, that blog post and the article, and really what that is about is questions amongst the core developers around the question we had around direction. And Scott asked before, does Acquia control the direction of Drupal or not? And as I stated unequivocally, we do not. So you know, a lot of that is around this about the discussion of who controls Drupal and where's the path forward and what's the right path. And because it's an open source community, these things happen in a very transparent and open manner. Everyone can see that, and you know, that has pluses and minuses. Certainly the plus is that it gets people engaged in that and they contribute and answer those questions. In addition, the issue queues and bug counts for Drupal are also available in a public forum on Drupal.org that anyone can see. So I would be very surprised if that looks any different than the bug counts and the tracking software that used by Sitecore or any other proprietary vendor behind the firewall that's not transparent and available. You know, I think that this certainly doesn't mean that their Drupal is particularly buggy or more buggy than any other type of software or any other vendor's version of software, but I think ultimately that is being an open source community is a very open, transparent environment, and you can get to see that the debates that are happening. The good news is people are passionate about Drupal. They care about the direction. They advocate very strongly, and that means that there's a future for Drupal because people care so much, and I think that's really the more important piece from that discussion around the Drupal crisis.
All right,
thanks.
gentlemen. Excellent questions, and I hope you were both pleased with the others' response. Scott, we have got to wrap it up. What a day we had today. That was just fabulous. This concludes our CMS Connected event. I want to thank our special guest, Scott Lewer, for co-hosting with me today. Scott, terrific job, great questions, and especially thanks to our vendor guests, Brian House from Acquia, representing Drupal, and Darren Guarnacha from Sitecore. Now, we did have a lot of questions coming in. For those of you that didn't get a chance to have your questions answered, we did the best we could. Or if you have a question for Drupal or Sitecore or product demonstration, please feel free to contact our guests using the contact information on the screen, or you can fill out the feedback form that is going to be mailed out to you shortly. We also did have a question from someone saying, hey, I'm loving this and I want to really listen and scrutinize the answers. Absolutely, you can do that. This whole webinar will be posted on cms-connected.com, so you can listen again. Also, if you have any suggestions for future matchups or you'd like to get involved with the show, please get in contact with us directly by using our email address right there on the screen. Quickly, I'd like to once again thank our CMS Connected sponsors, CM Pros, helping its 16,000 plus members all over the world to succeed, and Falcon Software. And if you'd like to discuss your web CMS project with Falcon Software, you can visit their website for contact information. All right, everybody, mark your calendars for our next CMS Connected show on October 20th. CMS, we're going to have an event showcasing two very popular enterprise solutions, Adobe and SDL. You can register today at cms-connected.com. We certainly hope you enjoyed today's show. We loved bringing it to you, and we look forward to hosting you all again on October 20th. Have a great afternoon.